Okay, so this is for Anatomy and Physiology 2, Chapter 17. This will be part 1. We'll go through the first 50 slides or so, and I might skip over a few, so just make sure you pay attention to that part of it as well. All right, so Chapter 17 is about the special senses. Sensation, we can either be conscious or subconscious, awareness of what's happening externally or internally. External in this chapter will mean light, striking the retina, sound waves, hitting that tympanic membrane in your ear, molecules in the air of the food, either to the nose or chemicals, taste, and the force of gravity that acts on the equilibrium receptors in the inner ear. So, the receptors for these special senses are distinct from one another, and they're located in specific regions in the head. We'll talk about those areas. You can just see here, here's the taste receptors and the taste buds. This is the inner ear. This is the eye. Here's the olfactory epithelium. And there's specific parts of the brain that receives the information from these special senses. So general senses, we just review, include somatic, so tactile, thermal, pain, sensation, proprioceptive, changes in movement, and visceral, so changes in your GI tract. They're scattered, relatively simple. Special senses, smell, taste, vision, hearing, equilibrium. They're located at specific regions in your head, anatomically distinct, and they form more complex pathways. First, olfaction is the process of perceiving smells. And smell and taste are very closely integrated in the way they're interpreted. For smell and taste, for the chemical to be detected, it needs to be dissolved in some kind of liquid. In the olfactory epithelium, it's the mucus, and in your mouth, it's the saliva. Taste goes up to your cerebral cortex to be consciously aware of it, and also it travels through the limbic system. So there's a lot of emotional response associated with taste, or triggers certain memories, or triggered by certain smells or tastes. They work together, like I said, taste and smell, but smell, olfaction, is much stronger or more sensitive. And for that reason, like when you have a cold, it's difficult to taste the food, not because your taste is obstructed, but the inflammation in your nasal cavity and or blockage, it prevents the smell of the foods. Okay, so the olfactory epithelium, where are those receptors located for smell? This is your nasal cavity. They're on the superior part, covering the surface of this cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and above the superior nasal conchae. And there's 3 types of cells in there. The actual receptor, which is a bipolar neuron, and they have these little cilia or olfactory hairs. Yes, you have hairs in your nose. These are different type of hairs. They go down right here, and then they're attached to the receptors. You have 10 to 100 million in your nose that respond to different, what are called odorant molecules. The supporting cells, down here you can see the supporting cells that support nourishment. I also want to point out this cell right here. This is mucus producing cell. And basal cells up here. Interesting to know about the basal cells in the olfactory and the epithelium is they are stem cells that are constantly replacing olfactory receptors. Because they only last, these receptors, olfactory receptors, only last for a period of time, and they're replaced. Interesting to note, remember, we talked about in the nervous system that neurons aren't replaced readily. Here's an example of an exception. The details here I don't want you to be too concerned about here. So I'm just going to delete that because we're not going to work with that. But the olfactory apparatus, that's from receptor to the nerve tract to the bulb, olfactory nerve to the actual olfactory tract. Okay, so that's the olfactory apparatus. Can detect 10,000 different odors, even in a small amount, 1 in 25 billion of a milligram per millimeter of air. So very sensitive, pick up on smells. Once generated, so those nerve impulses travel through olfactory nerves and up into the olfactory bulbs, which are in the base of your brain, to the olfactory tract, into the primary olfaction area, which is in your temporal lobe. You can see the pathway here on the cortex. So this is where it's perceived. Now, this is interesting to note. Olfaction is the only sensory system that has direct passage to the cortex without first going through the thalamus. These sense of smell, these olfactory sensory pathways, centrally, are rapidly adapting, meaning they can sense smell quickly, and also it's interesting to note that they decrease by activity or get less sensitive by the 50% in the first second, and completely accommodating, getting used to that smell essentially in the first 1 to 2 minutes. The supporting cells and glands in those areas are innervated by the facial nerve, which provides parasympathetic motor innervation. So your parasympathetic nervous system has some control over that. Also innervating the lacrimal gland, so tears, and mucous membranes. So this is why certain odors are linked to runny nose or production of tears, like onions, for example. I know I cry when I cut onions. Gustation. So this is taste, and it's simpler. The fact that we can only detect 5 main primary tastes: sour, sweet, bitter, salty, and umami. That's a meaty or savory flavor, and it's discovered by the Japanese, is believed to stimulated by MSG, which is naturally in some foods, and sometimes it's added to foods to increase their flavor. All their flavors usually are a combination of the other tastes. We have about 10,000 taste buds located on the tongue, including your soft palate, your pharynx, and your larynx as well, way back there. But as you get older, the number of taste buds decrease. Within every taste bud, okay, you have 50 gustatory receptors surrounded by, again, supporting cells. Again, the basal cells here are stem cells that rapidly replace these gustatory receptor cells because they are replaced, I believe, every 10 days. So if you've ever damaged a taste bud, maybe from hot cocoa or hot coffee, taste bud hurts, it'll fall off and be replaced by a new one or a new receptor, essentially. So this is electron micrograph of the histology of a taste bud. Here we see the receptor cells. Here's the taste pore, and these gustatory hairs come out of the pores. You have little hairs on the surface of your tongue that are connected to those receptors. And there it says, the gustatory receptor cells, lifespan of 10 days. Your taste buds change because your taste receptors change. Taste buds, there's 3 general types, and where they're located on the tongue is different. The very large papillae, valate papillae, are kind of look like the flying V at the back of your tongue, 100 to 300 taste buds, and then along the entire tongue are the fungiform papillae, and then on the sides, small trenches are the folate, but usually those are just in early childhood. And here is just the location of the valate. and the fungiform, the folate. We also see the filiform. These are tactile receptors, not a taste bud. So increase the friction between the food and the tongue, making it easier to move food in the oral cavity. These are the cranial nerves that have some control over the taste buds. The front part of the tongue, anterior, is the facial nerve. The posterior is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And then way back into the throat, epiglottis, the vagus nerve. Okay, so the nerve impulses go along these pathways to the medulla oblongata. They go through the hypothalamus, the limbic system, into the thalamus. Okay, so we receive taste consciously when they arrive at that primary gustatory area in the cerebral cortex, in the parietal lobe, somatosensory area. The threshold for taste varies depending on the taste. Most sensitive to bitter, like quinine, because poisonous substances have a dangerous quality, so it makes sense that we're most sensitive to that, protective in function. And then it goes, okay, so we're most sensitive to bitter, and then sour, and then sweet. Complete adaptation or getting used to specific tastes can occur between 1 to 5 minutes of continuous stimulation. All right. I'm going to go back to olfaction here. Smell. The danger thing here. No, I'll talk. I'll keep going. Vision. Eye is important for vision. And the accessory structures and the optic tracts and your primary visual cortex. So vision is responsible. The receptors are called photoreceptors, and they catch light in between invisible light from 400 to 700 nanometers. That's the wavelength of the light that we can perceive as visual light. So the eye and its accessory structures. When you look at somebody's eye, you can see some of them, but some of them you can't see. But the accessory structures are the extraocular muscles that move the eye. The palpebra, which is your eyelids, conjunctiva, inner lining of the eye. If somebody flips up their eyelids, that red stuff, that's the conjunctiva. Conjunctivitis is like pink eye or inflammation of that. Lacrimal glands produce the tears, and they're located up here, and we know the pupils opening for light that allows the light to pass to the back of the eye. So again, the eyelid, and there's different spaces called fissures. Essentially, there's a fissure right here on this end, and then on that end. This gland right here, that little raised red surface, produces oils that lubricate the eye. So there's different extraocular muscles that are served by different cranial nerves. Some muscles are responsible for lateral medial motion and superior inferior. What does the conjunctiva do? It's clear. Mucous membrane covers the eye. The lacrimal glands here, they produce the tears. The glands are located over here that lead to ducts. That the tears cover the surface of the eye. Essentially, the fluid goes over the surface and eventually gets to this end where it is removed and goes into the nasoduct. Most of the tears evaporate or go to the duct. But if you have a clogged duct, for example, over here, that's going to build up some tears in the eye, be watery eye, or your motions can have effect on how much how many tears are produced. Your body can't drain as fast, and also, of course, tears have a protective function. They lubricate they wash